From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. Wednesdays are known as committee days in the Alabama legislature, when more than 24 House and Senate panels meet to consider legislation moving through the process. But, as has been the norm here lately, today was also a legislative day, when the House and Senate convene to consider legislation on the floor. That all makes for a very busy day with a lot of moving parts. So let's dive right in, starting with the House Health Committee, which met for a public hearing on legislation that would codify the biological definitions of men and women into state law. House Bill 405 is sponsored by State Representative Susan DuBose, who is also sponsoring the Transgender College Athletes Bill. She said this bill, known as the What is a Woman Act, is also part of her goal of protecting women. The bill drew criticism from the LGBT activists who also held a rally at the State House this week. Several spoke out against the bill, calling it discriminatory.
I'm here to present HB 405, which is the What is a Woman bill. It's also known as the Women's Bill of Rights. And if you'd like to go to womensbillofrights.com, you can read all about details regarding this bill, which is making a movement around the country. Who would have thought it would be necessary to define age-old terms such as male, female, mother, and father? But when a Supreme Court justice cannot define what a woman is, the time has come to do something. We know common sense and science must prevail. The purpose of my bill is to codify definitions for some sex-based terms into state law. Male, female, man, woman, mother, father, sex are all defined for the purpose of this bill. Common sex-based words are used thousands of times in state law, but recently activists have sought to redefine these words and separate sex from biology. So why do we need this bill? If we don't codify the definition of common sex-based terms, laws that prohibit sex discrimination will cease to mean anything at all, and single-sex private spaces will disappear.
There was no vote taken on the bill, but the committee could take it up as soon as next week. Over in the Senate Judiciary Committee, legislation aimed at preventing texting while driving was on the agenda. Senate Bill 301 from Senator Jabo Waggoner would prohibit the use of a cell phone or laptop while driving. Waggoner was the sponsor of Alabama's original seatbelt law. He shared the tragic family story that makes this an emotional issue for him.
And I'm going to share it with you, and I don't talk about this often, but I had a young son, 18 years old. I bought him a Jeep for graduation because he was going to Jacksonville State on a football scholarship. And he was coming home one night, and we'll never know what happened, but I lost my 18-year-old son. And that's the reason these kind of issues have been important to me.
That bill advanced through committee and now goes to the Senate floor. Another vaping bill was up in Senate Judiciary today. Senate Bill 316 from Senator Vivian Figures would make it a crime for anyone under the age of 21 to possess a vaping product. Figures said the idea is not to be punitive, but to involve parents and get young people to stop vaping.
This bill is basically to bring awareness to our community, awareness to the parents of us getting to an epidemic stage of our children who are using these vaping devices. And we're losing our kids prematurely. It's estimated that we're going to lose over 100,000 kids in the next 10 years prematurely because of them vaping and how it damages their brains, their lungs, their bodies.
A reported 20% of high school students in Alabama admit to vaping daily, and Alabama has the nation's third highest percentage of people who vape. The numbers are rapidly increasing among middle school age children, and we are even seeing children as young as 7 and 8 years old beginning to vape.
That bill passed unanimously and now goes to the full Senate. Also in Senate Judiciary was a bill to criminalize doxing. House Bill 287 from State Representative Shane Stringer would make it a crime to use electronic means to publicly disclose someone's personal information with the intent to cause harm. Stringer told the story of judges and other public officials being targeted and even killed in making his case to the committee.
Approximately 2 years ago, my son's a Baldwin County Sheriff's deputy. Middle of the night, he was sitting at a closed service station doing a report on his computer. His dispatch called and said that he needed to move to a different location. So he left, he asked her what was going on, find out that someone had posted on their Facebook page that there was a deputy sitting at this service station if someone wanted to do something. And we get to researching it, looking into the guy, and the guy was a white supremacist out of Escambia County, and pretty much everybody on his page was the same.
Crimes and offenses towards elected officials and people in position of authority, that the rate has gone up like to 400% in the last 6 years.
That bill also advanced to the full Senate. The Senate Agriculture Committee held a public hearing on a bill to prevent Chinese entities and their government from purchasing land in Alabama. House Bill 379 is sponsored by State Representative Scott Stadhagen, who argues the measure is needed for security reasons. Senator David Sessions offered a new version of the bill, which the committee adopted and advanced. The change is meant to fix the perception that the intent was to target a certain ethnic group. Critics of the bill said they still had concerns about its implications.
We are prohibiting basically the governments, these foreign governments or the state-sponsored companies of foreign countries of concern. These foreign countries of concern, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, that's just a few of them. That's not all of them. This term does not include the country of Taiwan. Taiwan is an ally and a friend. We already have a federal Office of Foreign Assets Control that has a do not do business with list. And basically this legislation is mirroring that list.
I really appreciate all of the amendments you guys have made to this bill. I think it's much, much better than it was before, but I am still afraid that it might lead to some unintended consequences. Not only will people, brilliant-minded people who have moved here to Alabama, this will also deter people from outside of Alabama right now to even come and move here. And we're missing the opportunity to introduce lots of brilliant minds into our community.
Despite our contributions, Chinese Americans continue to face hardship and injustice. Bills like an HB 379, particularly as the form originally introduced, perpetuates crimes and xenophobia.
The Senate Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Development Committee took up legislation to put a 98-cent per month fee on phone lines to fund mental health crisis care. Senate Bill 328 from Senator Garland Gudger is meant to authorize funding for the state's 988 mental health crisis hotline and expand mental health crisis response statewide. The committee heard from several advocates who shared the need for greater mental health coverage and an alternative to 911 in crisis situations. State Representative Frances Holt Jones shared an emotional story about her husband's suicide and the lack of options when that crisis happened. Representatives from the telecom industry were also on hand, with one saying they support the idea but want a different way to fund it.
One Monday morning, 5:30 in the morning, my phone rang. It was my husband. And on the other end of the line, he said, "Are you asleep?" Then he said, "I just called to say goodbye." At that point in time, you become an expert. You immediately go into crisis mode, and you do the best darn sales job that you've ever done. You try to convince, in my case, my husband to stay on this earth. Talk about an immediate, untrained, emotional professional. I did the best job that I could for 13 minutes. After my husband said, "I love you, bye," at that point in time, I hung up the phone, and for the first time in my life, I dialed 911. They quickly answered and asked me the purpose of my call. With all the composure I could muster up, I attempted to calmly, factually, tell them where I thought my husband was and what I thought, what I knew, what my husband might have, what he probably had done. After my statement, the words I heard next, what the 911 dispatcher said to me, are etched in my brain forever. The 911 dispatcher said, "Hold, please." 988 would not have kept my husband on this earth. He had made his decision. And yes, 988 costs money. It's a fee. It's a tax. Call it a user fee. I don't really care what you call it. But it's the best way to have a solid cash flow into Alabama mental health assistance funding. It's not the only answer, but it's a heck of a good, solid financial start.
The proposed fee here is 98 cents. Fortunately, Chairman Reynolds lowered what was initially proposed, which was 98 as a minimum up to a maximum of $3. Now, it is, again, an issue of public policy for you all to decide whether this should be something from the wireless industry that, if it is a level of priority, and it is, funded through the general fund as opposed to a separate fee or a separate tax.
The 988 bill advanced, but because it is a revenue bill, the House version will have to be the one to advance through the process if it is to become law. As I mentioned, the House and Senate also met in chambers today to consider legislation. The Senate got caught up in a filibuster and was only able to pass local bills before adjourning. The House made it through almost halfway through its agenda. Here are some notable bills that passed today. House Bill 306 would require mail-order dental services like Smile Direct or Invisalign to have patients see an orthodontist in person at least once a year. It passed 77-11 and goes to the Senate. House Bill 208 would allow income tax credits for those who donate to pregnancy crisis centers in the state. That bill passed 99-3 and goes to the Senate. House Bill 293 would offer in-state companies economic incentives for shipping their goods out of the Port of Mobile. It passed unanimously and goes to the Senate. And House Bill 392 would clarify in state law that anyone prohibited from possessing a firearm under federal law is also prohibited under state law. It passed 64-36 and goes to the Senate. We learned more about the timing of both the grocery tax cut legislation and the education budget. Committee Chairman Danny Garrett said to expect both to move next week.
The Senate has not passed the grocery tax bill yet. There's a grocery tax bill that filed in the Senate that has 35 sponsors, and that Senate bill, we now had 100 sponsors in the House yesterday, so we dropped it in the House. Bills that affect revenue have to originate in the House, so to get the ball rolling, we really have to do that. So we filed the bill yesterday. It'll be in our committee next week and on the floor next Thursday. So I think people should know, because we had so much money in the supplemental, Senator Orr and I have worked very closely throughout the whole process. So a lot of what the comments that House members and that the Speaker and that myself would have were reflected in what the budget came down from the Senate. So we will make some changes, obviously, but for the most part, what came down from the Senate was not unexpected.
There have been a lot of bills related to the Education Trust Fund, such as the expansion of the Accountability Act, the grocery tax. Are there concerns about a lot of money leaving the Education Trust Fund?
Well, there's always concerns. Our number one priority is to protect the education budget. So I think you've seen a slowdown of any tax credits or anything that would withdraw from the education budget in either the House or the Senate floors. So we've kind of paused that. If the grocery tax priority is a priority, and it clearly is, then we have to put that as something that we're going to deal with, and that will cause us to take a pause on some other items.
And that's what happened today in the State House. Coming up next, I'll sit down with State Representative Jeremy Gray to talk about his legislation aimed to prevent cardiac arrest in high school sports. We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts.
Joining me next is State Representative Jeremy Gray from Opelika. Representative, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
Well, you've got a bill that is, at this point in the session, not a lot of bills have actually made it to the governor's desk. Yours has.
Mm-hmm.
Has to do with cardiac arrest
Mm-hmm.
and trying to prevent and teach high school folks about cardiac arrest on the athletic field, on the court, on the field.
Mm-hmm.
Walk me through how this bill got started and what got you interested in this.
Yeah, so a group out of Pennsylvania, Simon's Heart, they advocate for sudden cardiac arrest and cardiac issues. And so they reached out and basically said that Alabama didn't have anything as a protocol as far as sudden cardiac arrest prevention.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought that, a bill could be modeled after legislation in Tennessee and Florida and Georgia around educational components of sudden cardiac arrest. So I drafted a bill that essentially does three things. It requires that a coach gets trained every 2 years. Before this, a coach would just get trained once, right? Just kind of checking off the boxes as far as to become a coach. And then from there, it was on the coach to get that continuum training and education. This bill would essentially align AED training, CPR training, and sudden cardiac arrest prevention training all at one time every 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as things start to progress and more research around signs and symptoms are available, things to look for will change. So I think this was a great education component for the coaches, but it goes a little step further because it also requires that the student athlete goes through educational training so that they can understand. It's almost like the concussion bill, right? In order to understand that you have a concussion, you have to be educated on it, right? In order to know that you're having signs and symptoms of sudden cardiac arrest, you have to be educated on it. And so the final part of that bill, that it requires their parents to a parental form for their parents to sign, just acknowledging that they know what sudden cardiac arrest is, the signs and the symptoms, the warnings, things of that nature, so that it's liability from everyone, right? Everyone is liable for the safety and health of the student athlete. One more thing that it does is if a student athlete presents signs and symptoms and he has to be pulled from a game, he can't go back into the game until a physician approves him to go back into he or she to go back into a game. And so I think this is a great buffer for, sports is all about grit, all about being resilient, all about being tough. Mm-hmm. It's a gladiator sport. So everyone wants to play, right? Why would you want to sit out when you can help your team? This gives the coaches, the physicians, the ability to say you can't go in, because most student athletes, if they could go in and they could participate in any game, they will.
Yeah, you're not going to tell the doc or the coach like I feel wheezy. You're trying to compete. We were all watching that playoff game,
mm-hmm.
right, with the Bills, and he goes down, and I mean we were all just watching in shock. I mean, mm-hmm. the whole country was watching. Did that give better awareness to this issue? I mean, I was never aware of it before that, so I have to think a lot of people became aware of sudden cardiac arrest. Does that help you in passing legislation like this?
It really helped me because I played sports for 25 years and I've never encountered what I've known to be sudden cardiac arrest and just electrical current that hits the heart like a freak. It's almost like a freak accident. So in my mind, it's like this doesn't happen that much. Then you start doing the research and you say like, no, this happens a lot in baseball and basketball and mm-hmm. football and things of that nature. So for me being a former athlete, I wanted to advocate for student athletes, and that's why I was kind of passionate about it. And then I met Miss Dion Mack, whose son, I named the bill after, is Terrell Spencer's Act, right? And he was a young kid around like 17, 18. He passed away 12 years ago from sudden cardiac arrest, and he had an episode, and no one knew what to do. everyone froze. So you only have about 8 minutes to actually resuscitate this person and bring him back to life. And he wasn't as fortunate as DeMar Hamlin. He actually passed away, and she has been advocating for this for the last 12 years. And once I've met her, I brought her down to the State House. For me, it was like extra passion because I could put a name and a face with the bill as well.
Yeah. Well, you're right. DeMar Hamlin had the best medical care possible around him. But you mentioned concussions, and that's what we were talking about earlier. I had concussions when playing ball. Much lower level than you, sir. Much lower level. But it matters to me because had I just kept on playing, Lord knows where my head would be. But even back then, the concussion protocol wasn't really there. It started evolving. Like you mentioned, there was legislation. Is this sort of the next step? We got there on concussions. Do we need to get there on cardiac arrest?
Yeah, we have to get there on cardiac arrest, and I think this is a great start. But we also have to acknowledge that we need AEDs throughout, sports venues, and that was one of the things that the NFL is pushing with their coalition, that we don't have AEDs. If
is that the defibrillator?
Yes, defibrillator. Okay. If you have 3 or 4 spring sports going on at one time and you only have 2 defibrillators, what happens when an episode happens and you don't have those in a 3-minute retrieval time? Because you only have 8 minutes to really save a student athlete's life. So we need to deploy more AEDs throughout the state of Alabama. So there is bigger problems than sudden cardiac arrest, but I think this is a great start, and we can build to do other things like get defibrillators in sporting arenas, and also really engage in getting physical trainers and athletic trainers, because that was a profession that people really indulge in, and now it's declining.
Well, we don't have much time left, but I wanted to get to your other bill. This has to do with juvenile justice and some reforms you're seeking on that. Can you walk me through what this bill does?
Yeah, so the Alabama Code really requires juveniles and adults to be treated the same, right? And so when you talk about fines and fees, last year I had a bill around fines and fees where it would basically give an inmate coming into society a 6-month grace period to pay fines and fees.
You're going to need some time to earn some money.
That's right? So think about adult. Well, what happens when you're 13, 14, 15, 16 years old and you don't have a job? And you have to still pay these fines and fees. You're on probation. You have to go through all of these steps as well, but you don't have income coming in. You're not even old enough to actually even get a job. So what happens to those fines and fees? Well, it extends probation period, right? It put hardships on the mother or the father. It even affects other siblings, right? So what happens when you have 4 children and 3 of your children are angels and you have one that just seems to get in a little bit of trouble, right? Should that one affect those 3? And so this is a way to abolish the fines and fees, except for restitution, because Alabama is really not recouping a lot of that money. It's only 5% of the funds have been recouped in maybe the last 12 years. And so you're talking about $500,000 to $800,000 over a 10-year span. So it's not actually doing what it's supposed to do. It's really creating a pipeline to prison. And I think this is a way of curbing that and really making young children, juveniles, productive citizens. Because we understand once you get in the system and once you have to keep paying these fines, these fees, and this hardship, that sometimes causes you to commit crimes and do other things.
So it's like a cycle, and you want to try to break that cycle. When you talk to your colleagues in the House and in the Senate, do you sense any support for this? Can you get some momentum?
We'll see. When you're trying to pass anything with criminal justice reform,
it's very fraught.
It's just tough. And even with the grace period bill that I had last year, even though it passed, I was on the floor for like 2 or 3 hours debating the bill, and the only thing it was doing was delaying money to the budget. It wasn't getting rid of the money. It was just delaying. So it's probably going to be a tough battle, but I'm up for the challenge, and at least we can have something on the books. And Judge Hill does a great job of bringing everyone to the table and figuring out a compromise. So I just look forward to having further communications with him. And if it doesn't pass this year, that's fine.
Sometimes it takes a few years.
It takes a while,
on stuff like that.
That's
yeah,
right.
You're right. We're out of time. But Representative Gray, thanks again for coming on Capitol Journal.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
The 375,000 acres that make up the 3 ranger districts of Talladega National Forest were purchased by the federal government in 1936 as part of an effort to restore clear-cut timberlands and farmlands no longer capable of producing crops. The beautiful reserve includes the 102-mile Pinhoti National Trail System and Alabama's highest and second highest points, Mount Cheaha and Duggar Mountain.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow night at 10:30 with more coverage of the Alabama legislature right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capitol Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.